Hi, everyone. We want to take this time to introduce one of our amazing students to you, Natasha Holmes. And she is joining us from Australia, and she works with a denomination there called the Uniting Church. And she is one of our officially certified spiritual entrepreneurs who have graduated from our certificate in spiritual entrepreneurship. And she's here with us to talk to you a little bit more about why she took the course and kind of the future of spiritual entrepreneurship kind of as she sees it.
I started the spiritual entrepreneur course because it became, I've always been really excited by the whole entrepreneurship kind of thing, and it's becoming very clear that the churches here need to start looking at new ways of being church. And we have a lot of aging congregations and who over the years are becoming less connected to youth and young adults, and it's concerning.
The few times we've talked now, you've kind of talked about this sect of the denomination that you kind of work within, which is more of like, and we talk about this all the time as Hatchery being kind of R&D, research and development for the church to kind of see what's shifting and where we're going and asking kind of tomorrow's questions. You're kind of doing a similar thing with Uniting. You're working in a particular area with a particular team that is looking towards innovation. One, what is that like? And two, how did that come about? How did people say we need innovation in this particular area, or what brought about kind of looking to the future?
I feel like we're still in the thick of having that innovation conversation and getting I think I wrote in some of the stuff I sent to you around, one of the questions that we're asking churches to look at is the whole thing around being the guest and being the host. And the churches are so used to being the host. Like, you come to us, we provide you ABC, and they want to continue to be in that position. Whereas in some ways we're asking them, well, we've got so much property and so much buildings. What if we became the guest rather than the host? What if the building, goes to someone else, goes to something community development related, or turns into a cafe, or based on what the needs of that community is, what is that building going to be made the best use of? And then as the church, how do we rally around that and connect to community and figure out what spirituality looks like in that context?
What are some of the things you felt that really resonated with you in the course, or kind of the direction that we take this whole thing?
I thought the balance between the content, but also the freedom to kind of have the process of actually soaking all that information in was really good. Like, you didn't feel the pressure of there's a lot of information and now you've got to like pretty much sort yourself out. Sort of like, there was always permission to let it breathe and let it marinate and kind of soak it all in and then respond, which I thought was really helpful.
How have you, or how do you see others try to answer this need, to be able to have this space, just what you just described? How have you or others tried to answer that in the past, but how has this maybe been different for you?
I don't know if much of this has been done in the past, if that's what you mean. I don't think self-reflection is often, apart from as we do well in church, there's a lot of structure around, okay, make sure you have your supervision and make sure, you're creating time for yourself. And, there's sort of those key things that often, I think, church languagey, processy kind of compliance stuff are in place. But I don't know whether there's much of this conversation happening where people are really challenged to look at how they're spiritually growing. Like, I often don't hear a lot of that in the work that I do, which I think is concerning. Often we're talking about, how's your church going? How many people are going to it? What's the challenges? But often it's sort of like, why isn't our language about how are you going?
How did you personally work with the balance of maybe the sense of being self-reflective, but also proactive, like actually having to think about, I just can't sit in this space. I have to hold both of these spaces.
Well, because it was so relevant to me in my work. And I think because there was really good space to be able to wrestle with some of the things we were learning, I actually felt compelled to put it into practice. Like you sort of, I think if there's that platform where it is actually directly speaking into your context and your work, and I think that's probably the key, is that you need to be able to be in a position to be willing to let go and enter into something new and be expecting some sort of transformation, not kind of going in and going, oh, you know, that whole thing about changing but not wanting to change anything, like wanting everything to change, but as long as I don't have to change anything. So I think if you come into the course kind of going, yes, you know, it's desperate times, there needs to be change, and I'm laying everything down and I'm open to learning as much as possible. So I was putting stuff into practice as soon as we kicked off, because it was directly relevant to my work. So I found it really helpful, actually.
There are different contexts that people may take this course from. A personal context, a ministry context, from an actual vocational context, but then also a greater context of how are we as church, you know, or as an organization or as a group developing this. You get to sit in a couple of different positions, perspectives. What would you say to somebody from any one of those positions on why this might be helpful for them?
So, I mean, from a church inside ministry kind of model, I think that the benefits of doing this course is great, because it really does take you outside of, you know, those four walls and puts you in a position where you do have to kind of be vulnerable to everything changing, and I think that's a good thing. And I think that it's something that it's almost like if we don't do that, there's not much, that the future isn't bright. Like, I think that courses like this are really going to equip people to have the confidence to make some daring and bold decisions. And I think like, if I was going to talk about with outside the church, it actually does give you a great landscape as to, like, if you were coming into it and not knowing about church, I think it takes you through the history, the challenges, you know, the potential for the way forward, and it could, you know, actually generate some excitement about both, like, an understanding about the challenge of the way forward, but also the hope. And I think that I would definitely recommend that to people outside of the church as well as inside.
What would you say to someone who might be considering that this might not be something for them, but from your experience, you might encourage them in that way?
From a different time zone? Like, if that was
different, it could be a different culture, different time zone. And the other part is that the number of people who were from different cultures and different time zones, and what that might be as a benefit.
Well, for me personally, I entered the course just as I started a new job. And so one of my thoughts was that I'm not sure how I'm going to cope with doing all of this stuff, but it actually was very manageable. And I think if you're coming into the course with a real heart for the content and actually wanting to see change, you find yourself making the time for it, because it actually helps you along the journey, and being in connection with, you know, the great lecturers that you have, but also being connected to people all across the, you know, the world in different contexts and different ministry positions is actually really encouraging. And I wasn't able to do a lot of the live feeds because of the time difference, but I didn't feel like I was any less connected to the people on the course. You can connect with anyone involved in the course as much as you want to, offline or in the live feeds.
When you take someone through content like this and you're asking them to innovate everything, you know, and kind of release their grip of like control or certainty really on anything, and just sort of look towards the future in terms of innovation, it can be a really scary thing. Obviously people are coming to the course because they're attracted to the material and what we put out there. So they are really in a headspace and a heart space where they're like ready to receive. But it's also really scary because we're asking people to essentially innovate on their calls and innovate on their theologies and innovate on their ecclesiologies and just all sorts of things. What's a bit of encouragement or really an invitation that you would give to somebody?
I think with these sorts of things, I would say that life is short. I would say that, if we're really looking at what we're doing and a responsibility to the role that we play in any sort of ministry or anything that's connected to faith, I think we need to continue to challenge ourselves and put ourselves in places that are going to stretch our minds and take us away from, that sort of routine that we get into with our ministry. I just would say that there's nothing to lose by being bold. The way that the world is evolving and everything that we have to look at in the way of technology and the way that people connect these days, we have to be looking at new ways of being church and new ways of connecting with people outside of our church communities. And so, not even church communities, but in our relationships with each other. Not many people are doing work around the entrepreneur space. That's often, sort of kept to the business world or kept to, those people that are inventing magical things. And in lots of ways, we see those things growing. So doesn't it make sense to bring that into the faith space and look at creating magic of our own? And if we're looking at nurturing people's faith journeys, spirituality, I think we have a responsibility to be educating ourselves and learning new models of being church and, connecting with people.
Part of our goal in this Future and Faith series of conversation is to say, hey, you know what? We're having the conversation. We know you're having the conversation. Like, let's have the conversation.
Yeah.
Essentially, when you talk about church creation and when you talk about some of the statistics and some of the research, everybody's like, yeah, I know. What are we going to do? What's happening? What's our next step? What's the new direction? And so everybody's having these conversations, like, smaller pockets. And it's like, let's collectively talk about the future together. That's kind of what we want to do. We want to bring people together. So, all right. Well, thank you again so much.
No, thank you.
From across the crazy amount of time zones. And we will talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, thanks,
you.
Tash. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Everyone, we are here with one of our students, our graduates actually, a certified spiritual entrepreneur, Alex Tan, who is joining us all the way from Malaysia. So Alex, thank you so much for making this work with the time difference and all of that. We so appreciate you, and we've just appreciated having you in the course and your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about what you do and your ministry context.
All right. As you mentioned, Maria, I'm from Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and in my context, of course, is a multi-racial, multi-ethnic group in my country, many religions, and right here in Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia, I serve in a church that is we consider it a mega church because of its number of people. And so what I do here is fundamentally, I am someone who tries to solve problems and find gaps, in the systems of the church. And besides the usual shepherding and teaching and even worship leading, and that's what I do as well in church here.
Your context is from a large church and in Malaysia. So there is this sense that a number of people are looking at this course and they're thinking, oh, I come from this context or this context. It's pretty amazing the diversity of people and personalities and theologies and backgrounds, but somehow it seemed like there was some common thread.
there's always the big why of why we do what we do, and we're not so quick to just say, hey, bring it on, and I'll believe everything you say. And so there's always a big why, WHY. And out of that stems a curiosity, and of course stemming from a love for God and the things of His heart, and how do we express it in a way that's true to ourselves and to our context, and yet learning how to appreciate diversity in the midst of what we hold to be true, and how do we hold that tension together, what is truth and there's diversity, and so how do we journey with that forward. So I think that would be, I think that would be a common ground that we have in most churches, large and smaller, because things, we still find ourselves, I would say, at least from my journey, answering yesterday's questions more than answering new questions. And I think that that's something that not all will say it that way, but we are answering yesterday's questions more. So that would be a common ground, I think, that we need to answer new questions of our landscape today.
Been an investment for you. I mean, like what were the difficult parts of it, but then also what might be some of the payoffs of that?
Right. But I would say this, that which I'm learning, that what is so, if I can say, immeasurable, is the thinking, curating, and creative process of our thinking that actually would be able to bring us forward and do things that matter, more than sustain things that may not be working. So I think that itself is an investment worth considering, because the future is wide open, and there's so many possibilities while we are rooted in traditions and stakeholders. But I think it's invaluable when we can open up ourselves to new ways of thinking that are guided and not just left alone, but we have people journeying with you. And so that itself is a good investment.
So one thing that we've noticed, and it's sort of par for the course when you're doing innovation work and looking towards new things and looking towards the future, because it really forces you to look at some of the older models that maybe aren't working so well, which is why we're looking to the future and to new models and new structures of sustainability. But it can be really difficult as well. There's a lot of deconstruction that happens. There's reconstruction that happens. There's new things that are being built, but sometimes at the expense of some old things going away or dying or having to be reformed. And that can be a really painful process. And so what is something you would say to encourage someone along the journey?
But if we can play a part to hold this piece of a puzzle and recognize the framework of what it's trying to build and fit the piece at the right place, with others holding a different piece to fit in, I think it's a lot of value to that. And is there risk? Yes. Are there things to deconstruct? A whole lot. But I think as our eyes are set on Him, the author and perfecter of our faith, I think we're on the right path, even through the pain points that we will encounter.
Thank you so much for those words of encouragement. And again, thank you so much for being a part of this course. You brought so much to the table.
As you have been kind of meeting with that group, what do you think some of the issues that, have you found any common threads of where people find themselves now? What is the need of that group? What kinds of things come up in there,
Yeah, I think the biggest needs, I think, are I think language is a big need, just at a really general level, because we don't really have the terms to talk about some of this stuff. And so I think that's one thing that this course does, is it gives you the language to talk about some of these things.
Maybe with that, how have you seen this course maybe help you with some first steps or
Yeah, I think this course has helped. I think the lean methodology and the lean canvas just give a process to, like, all right, well, here's an idea and here's the next thing I can do. Because I think coming from a church background where we tend to like to have the answer before we start a lot of times, or like to have the end goal in mind before we start. I think this eases that part of, that part of me coming out of church world, because there is something you can do, right? There is a thing you can do. You can, and I also thought the language of the felt need was really helpful, because I think that's something we can all resonate with.
Where does the theological aspect come in for you?
I think for me personally, the innovative theology was very permission giving, if that, because it didn't, I've sensed that for a long time in my own theological journey. Like that's been something that's seemed obvious to me, but not obvious to anybody. Like a lot of people you talk to within an organization or institution. So hearing someone else say it is comforting, because, I am very familiar with, because of some of my more evangelical background, I'm very familiar with the whole, keep the theology the same, but change the methodology. Like that's very familiar to me. And it doesn't take long to run up against where that theology comes short. It's really easy to sometimes change the outside of things and to make things programmatically look different or stylistically look different. There's a lot of permission giving in that front, but there's always the same theological underpinning underneath it. And you're always going to keep running up against the same walls.
What would you say to somebody who says, oh, well, this is just going to teach one type of theology, versus really innovating where you're at, your theology of where you're at, because there could be a sense of anything new, any change, something different. How did you approach this in a way of saying that you really kind of help your own theological perspective move forward, not trying to change you to a position, but inviting you to move forward in your position, to innovate your theology?
Yeah, I would say that it gives you the method or the vehicle that you can then put in your own theological trajectory within. Because I think this course set the framework by sort of talking about the three different major shifts or changes at the beginning of the course. That kind of like sets the stage for just theology in the 21st century. And so that kind of gets us all into the same realm. And then I think you can, as long as you bring a flexibleness to it of your own theology and your own willingness to change and innovate your theology, then I think, it gives you the vehicle or the method to then kind of take wherever your own traditions or wherever your own theology, it can kind of take you wherever it goes from there, but it opens you up to sort of where theology is headed in some ways, or already is in many ways.
Work with these groups, and it seems like a lot of denominations, a lot of organizations and groups are starting to form work task groups to ask the questions you are asking right now. What advice or what input would you give to someone who might be in that position about how this might have some impact on their journey, where they're at, what they're trying to figure out?
Yeah, I think one of the first thing I would say is like, don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask any question. I think at this stage of the game, everything needs to be examined and questioned and explored. And I think it gets within denominational structures, we have the things that we can't talk about, and we have the things that we can't change. And I think if we don't put all of those things on the table to at least have a conversation about, then we are going to limit ourselves from the beginning.
How has your conversation changed? How is your outlook? How is your thought? How's your approach to these kinds of things that you saw before and now after?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that this has helped me do is I was running into the problem of me personally being willing to explore and innovate and think within my own thinking, but not knowing how to translate that into action within within my scope of influence within my job. And so, so this has given me a language and a method that can then say, let's go try this, and here's some steps to try this. And let's go. It's helped me to bridge the conversation of where I've sensed the church going and my own intuition, and then bring that into people who may not be there yet, but this is a way to bridge that conversation that's not just intellectual. It's not just an intellectual conversation or an academic conversation or a theological conversation. Here's how we can do this on the ground.
Understand about this if they were thinking about signing up to be a spiritual entrepreneur?
I would say, the first thing is it's a really low risk, right? It's a super affordable program that you can jump into. And that's one of the first things that attracted me to it is like, I've got a continuing ed budget through my job, and it didn't take very much of that to do this course, which is great. And so the risk is very, very low, but the upside is very, very high. So like and that's what I would say is a huge benefit is, even out of all the segments, if one thing latches onto you, it's worth it. Because it's all great material, and it's all benefited me in my thinking, but each piece of it has helped a different aspect of my ministry. The first part has really helped give me the language, the rest of the course really helped give me more practical steps. But even if if one of those really sunk in, it would have felt worth it, because it's a lot of good information at a very low risk.
Was there an aha for you that we're not even aware
that
of?
was a byproduct?
Yeah,
Right.
I'm just kind of getting at,
Yeah, I think this. My guess would be that this was partially intentional on you all's part, but I think the fact that this does still build connections is helpful. It's good. The whole networking side of this is really helpful, because even within church and ministry world, there's still the network of people that are trying to think in this way is somewhat limited. It's growing. And so, I think that's a benefit that transcends a lot of this too, is like the fact that, I do know individuals now I could reach out to and say, hey, I ran into this issue. I could shoot an email to somebody and say, ask those kind of questions. So, that's a huge benefit.
Was there any surprise in connecting innovative theology and lean methodology? How did you feel about that kind of format in that sense of the combining of these?
Yeah, it did surprise me, not because I didn't think they would connect, but because I never would have thought to bring them together. And this was really the first time I'd heard the term innovative theology. I'd heard some theological elements within innovative theology, like, we talked a little bit about radical theology. We talked a little bit about things I had heard of. And I knew through the promo for the course, and because of my familiarity with you guys as an organization, I had known your connection to sort of lean methodology and bringing that into ministry world. So that was the main thing that drew me in, was I was interested in this whole, like, taking this whole startup idea and bringing it into ministry world. That was what initially sparked my interest.
What does it mean that there is such a challenge and such an opportunity in our faith context? It's even a scary thing to even come into consciousness about, I think. So thanks again for sharing your story, your bravery, your courage, and allowing us to be a part of the journey,
Yeah, well, of course. Yeah, it's, I think for me personally, I think this course has coincided with me becoming more involved within my denomination and institution. And this course has helped me to not like pull my hair out through that process. Because, for years I'd heard, that institutions, it's like turning a freight liner. It's like turning a massive ship. And I've always kind of bought into that. But now I'm wondering more if it's like we need to get on a lifeboat and leave that ship and go build a different one instead of trying to turn the one that we have just very slowly. But this course has helped me to see that that there are other methodologies out there. We don't have to necessarily try to fix a broken methodology. We can maybe just bring a new methodology to the table. And that's been really helpful for me as I'm getting more involved in my own, like I said, my own personal stuff with this, which is in some ways getting closer to the institution, which was not really my intention to begin with, because so it's been a weird part of me for this last year and a half or so, but this course has helped that. So,
and it's not to separate, it's to go and see the uncharted territories in that way. And I think you're a great example of doing that from within your organization. Again, not as something to detract from, but something to add to. In that.
Yeah, and I've been using the metaphor and the language of scarcity and abundance, because I think the idea that I run up against is, well, if you do this, then there's not room for this, and which is fundamentally like comes from a perspective of scarcity. Like, there's only enough for all of us, and if you take this piece, that means we can't have that piece, and I think it's been helpful to me to reframe that language and say, can't both exist at the same time in their fullness. Do we believe that there's abundance for enough of this to exist simultaneously? And I would argue that yes, there is enough space for this new thing to exist alongside of the old of the other thing, without them being mutually exclusive. So, all right, y'all too. Bye.